In 1933, within the quiet corridors of the palace of the Pakur Raj, a death of the young Raja stirred more than grief. It raised suspicions. What seemed at first a tragic illness soon unravelled into one of India's most chilling and unusual murder cases, when the Raja's own elder half-brother was accused of using a deadly germ as a weapon, turning modern science into a tool of silent assassination. Beneath the surface of royal decorum lay a dark tale of betrayal, ambition, and microscopic murder. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories, Season 9, Episode 7. I'm your host, Ben. Today, I'm back with a full episode, and it's an exciting one. I'm quite into it because it's set in India, which is nice because sometimes I feel like Dark Histories gets a little trapped in with sort of telling stories that are pretty much just from like America or Britain. Occasionally we sort of branch out, but sometimes I feel like I'd like to branch out more. So it's always good to be, spreading my wings a little bit, I guess. So yeah, this one is from India, which is great. No sort of real news of note. I hope everyone enjoyed Yesterday Today. Again, that'll be next week. So yeah, if you enjoyed it, great. I'm really glad. I'm sort of in that stage at the moment where just sort of judging, trying to work out if people sort of listen to it or enjoy it or whatever. If it's something that people want me to continue doing. If you did enjoy it, then yeah, great news. That I'll be back, say next week. But until then, anyway, let's just crack on with this episode. I should probably point out that in this episode, it uses a lot of old place names, so names that were from the British India. Now they've changed names, but just for the sake of the fact that it's set, in a historical time, I use the contemporary names for the places. So, if that's causes any confusion, that's the reason I sort of chose to do that. Anyway, this episode is called "The Poisoned Prince: The Germ Murders of the British Raj." Calcutta of the 1930s was a wild, thriving city packed with contrasts. On the eastern coast of India, connected to the sea by the Hooghly River, the city had, until 1911, been the capital of British India, before it had moved to Delhi, primarily for political reasons. Still central to the British colonial operation in India, Calcutta had only continued to thrive since the switch, and its streets were more lively than they ever had been before. A truly multicultural city, Indians from across the country mixed with British, Chinese and Armenians, to name a few. The very city itself displayed a similar cosmopolitan air, as colonial architecture stood directly next to sprawling Indian neighbourhoods. The Victoria Memorial, built from sparkling white marble in the Italian Renaissance style as a memorial to Queen Victoria by the British Raj, stood imposing over the bustle of traditional Indian streets, packed full with motor cars and hand-pulled rickshaws, weaving round the trams that had been operating since the turn of the century. The Hooghly River, so much the lifeline of the city, was just as busy as the streets, as ferries and merchant vessels chugged up and down day and night. As a major industrial hub, jute mills, coal wagons and barrels of tea stacked tall on the back of horse-drawn carts came and went as the heaving port, the busiest in all of Asia, contracted and expanded with the trade that was so central to the life of the city. Across the river, the vibrant red bricks of Howrah train station, with its sharply geometric clock tower, was the main travel hub for the city, and for all of India, having operated since the mid-19th century as one of the country's busiest railway junctions. Cinemas were popular across India, and especially so in Calcutta, which boasted 14 theatres. Starting with the earliest silent bioscopes, the thriving Bengali movie scene was breaking out, competing with British and American talkies that had taken a movie-loving population by storm. Popular amongst the British and Indians alike were the Sherlock Holmes films, made by Stoll Studios in Britain, that piggybacked off the back of the popularity of the books, which had all been imported, translated and fully integrated into the Anglo-Indian culture decades earlier. Alongside cinemas, jazz clubs, restaurants and hotel bars took a roaring trade as those that could afford vice partook freely. As marvellous as the city was, much of the architecture, culture and trade only sought to highlight some of the inequalities between the affluent elite and the impoverished majority. As migration had overtaken the ever-expanding city, whose population had recently risen past 1.5 million, slums had sprung up throughout the area, stoking a major source of tension for the city that was as peaceful as it was turbulent. The 1930s were turbulent political times in India too, and Calcutta, with its coffee houses packed with students smoking cigarettes and debating Marx, Gandhi and Freud, was no exception. Nationalist movements, springing from the desire to break free of British rule, were making strides in the early 1930s, as Gandhi's civil disobedience movement stoked the fires of activism, leading to boycotts of British goods, mass protests and labour strikes. On the flip side, communist movements also began to break ground, and though any official communist activities had been banned by the British, underground movements popped up sporadically, proving popular amongst students and workers. The British response to all the unrest was mainly in the form of brutal repression, which only worsened the division as tens of thousands of Indians were thrown in jail for their protest, paving the way for the rise of militant nationalism. Calcutta, which saw several violent protests, was a perfect example of the boiling pot of a nation whose lid was beginning to quake. At the same time, traditional Indian politics were no less turbulent. The zamindars, a ruling class of lords and barons who had acted as feudal landlords for centuries, collecting taxes, renting land to farmers, investing in education and culture, and exploiting the masses, were being squeezed by the British, who recognised their positions in return for a monthly stipend. In turn, the zamindars frequently pressured the peasants and farms that lived on the land, further entrenching rural inequality. It was yet another example of the contrasts that made up the daily life of Calcutta. While some landowners drove cars through the streets and peasants pulled rickshaws, one zamindar trotted through the city on a cart pulled by a zebra, purely as a show of wealth. Amarendra Chandra Pandey and Benayendra Chandra Pandey were two Bengali zamindar brothers whose lands, situated just to the north of Calcutta, lent them both to visiting the city frequently. Benayendra, who struggled to resist the vice that such a city could offer a young, carefree member of the elite classes, was especially fond of the city life. Much like the city itself, the two brothers seemed to mirror the contrasts and conflict of Calcutta. And much like India, their lives too were a bubbling pot, whose contents were set to boil over in dramatic fashion. Benayendra Chandra Pandey was born in 1901, 10 years before his younger half-brother, Amarendra. Born into an old zamindar family, they had been ruling over the Pakur Raj, one of the richest swathes of land in all of Bengal, 180 miles north of Calcutta, renting out rice farms, mines and timber forests that pulled in a healthy income of around £20,000 a year, which was equivalent to nearly $250,000 today. This sat them squarely in an elite class of gentry with access to huge wealth. Their father, Protopendra Chandra Pandey, had died 4 years earlier in 1929 from a bacterial infection, leaving the entire estate to the two brothers, including a huge whitewashed palace built like a fortress with balconies and parapets looking out across their land. Before their father had passed away, the zamindar business had been good, and the family had branched out into money lending to supplement their already extravagant wealth. Benayendra's mother had died when he was only 3 years old, and so he spent most of his childhood being raised by his aunt, Surjabati, a wealthy widow in her own right. Benayendra's father had been quick to remarry following his mother's death, but she also passed away. But his new wife also passed away prematurely when she gave birth to Amarendra, leaving the new child to also be raised by Surjabati, who was now splitting her attention between the two young heirs. This was the start of a hatred and resentment that would continue to grow within Benayendra as he grew older and learnt that not only had Amarendra taken the affection of his surrogate mother, but would also grow up to dilute his inheritance, which would now be split between the two sons. Despite this tragic death of both the boys' mothers, the two brothers grew up in absolute luxury, in a life that most in India, especially those that rented land from the Pandeys, would have swapped in an instant. Amarendra was studying at the elite university of Patna College, established in the mid-19th century and one of the oldest universities in India. Benayendra, meanwhile, was busy enjoying his own life, playing tennis, riding horses, and being chauffeured around Calcutta, where he indulged in his love of cinema and rented a city suite stocked with whiskey and 2 mistresses, a prostitute named Chanchala and an actress named Balika. When his mistresses weren't enough for him, he was not shy on frittering away the family treasury on more prostitutes. It was a good time to be rich in the city, and his drinking, partying and womanizing kept pace with the flow of money through the estate's hands. Unfortunately, for someone interested in the vices that Benayendra partook in, it was a pretty bad time for syphilis. Whilst prostitution was illegal, it was mostly ignored in the larger cities, and with such a rampant sex trade, STIs were always following close behind. In one study, it was discovered that almost 30% of all hospital patients in India were suffering from syphilis at one stage or another. With no STI clinic in Calcutta at all, it was quite the hive of bacterial activity. For Benayendra, the Zaminda life was perfectly fine, but he dreamt of being a movie producer. For him, Indian films were either too risque for the rural types or too boring for the educated classes. He looked at British and American films, and he wanted to invest in a world of Indian cinema that could emulate their wide appeal and compete for the attention of the masses. By 1933, the brothers' relationship had been well and truly sour for some time. Benayendra resented Amarendra's constant need for income, be it for doctor's bills, tutoring sessions or university fees, and Amarendra had grown frustrated watching his brother running the family estate in his own self-interest. Still, the two had at least been tolerant in their recent family visit to Calcutta, and now, on Sunday, the 26th of November of 1933, with Amarendra headed back to Pakur, Benayendra had even seen it within himself to break with tradition and had actually travelled with the rest of the family to see his younger half-brother back on the train and wave him off. As the family entourage, including the boy's aunt, Surjabhati, their niece, Anima Devi, and their sister, Banabala, made their way to platform 3 of Howrah station, Amarendra stopped into the ticket hall and secured their travel passes before weaving through the crowds to join them by the departure area. Just as he stepped into the departure hall, he felt a strong bump on his right side and a sharp pinch on his upper arm, as someone he described as a short, muscular stranger collided with him and then set off as quick as he'd come, disappearing into the crowd. In a shot of panic, Amarendra rubbed his sore arm and pulled up the sleeve of his shirt, which he felt was wet with an oily yellow substance. Looking closely, he noticed a small pinprick in his skin. In somewhat of a panic, he mentioned the strange situation to his family as he approached them by the train, who all suggested that he stay back in Calcutta and get a blood test, just to make sure that everything was okay. Tetanus was a serious concern in India at the time, and Amarendra was all too aware of just how fatal an infection it could be, having recently survived a nasty bout of it himself. With some anxiety, he aired his concerns with his older brother, who grabbed his arm, rubbed the tiny wound with his thumb, and told him to stop being so anxious all the time. Pressuring him to get on the train and get himself home, he pulled rank and ordered him to do as his older brother suggested and try to relax. Accepting that Benayendra was probably right, and it was all just an overreaction, he stepped aboard the train headed for Pakur and settled down for the journey as his sister cleaned the wound with iodine. By the time that Amarendra reached the palace back in Pakur, he was already feeling a little bit better about the pinprick. His sister had cleaned the wound, and he had felt no ill effects, but still, his uncle advised him to make an appointment with the doctor back in Calcutta just to be sure. Amarendra made an appointment the following Wednesday, and 3 days later, feeling fit as he ever had, he stepped back on board a train headed south and visited the office of a respected Calcutta doctor named Nalina Ranjan Sengupta. The doctor gave Amarendra the once-over, and seeing nothing wrong and also quite sceptical of Amarendra's train station attack story being anything to worry about, he suggested he stay the night in Calcutta and try to put the pinprick out of his mind. Prescribing some generic medication for bacterial infections, he waved him off, happy that he would be fine. Relieved, Amarendra headed back to his hotel and got some sleep. The next morning, however, his anxieties came back with some vengeance, after he woke to find a swollen lump on his right arm where the pinprick had been, and a tender swelling in his right armpit. Worse, as the morning drifted by, He also developed a raging fever, topping out around 39 degrees. Once more, he called the doctor, who contacted some of his colleagues from the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine, and all of them paid Amarendra a visit that afternoon, taking blood samples for analysis, which they got to work on right away, finding a slightly raised white blood cell count, but otherwise nothing especially untoward. Most of the doctors had suspected that the young lad might have been suffering from a bout of malaria, but the blood sample showed no evidence. Nonplussed, they could only sit back and wait to see what might develop in the blood sample and wait for the disease to pass through. Unfortunately for Amarendra, whatever the disease was only developing as the hours ticked by. The next morning, his fever had topped 40 degrees, and his arm had swollen considerably, with the pinprick wound letting out a foul-smelling discharge. By noon, he was struggling to breathe normally, and doctors were pretty sure that he had water on his lungs. By Sunday, no cultures had still grown in the blood sample back in the lab, but doctors were all taking Amarendra's rapid decline in health incredibly seriously. Whatever he was suffering from, it had progressed with some aggression, and several doctors had visited Amarendra only to come up blank. A discussion had been aired that he'd possibly been suffering from anthrax poisoning, but none of them could really be sure, and besides, this idea of someone injecting anthrax into him as he crossed a busy train station in broad daylight seemed much too ridiculous to be true. Amarendra's family were less sure, and fearing that Benayendra may have finally set out to remove his brother from his inheritance, dark suggestions began to swirl. Though once again, no one could really believe such a thing, and calling the police would only lead to a scandal being brought upon the family. By evening, Amarendra was only able to breathe through an oxygen mask. An emergency purchase of some medication to help with pneumonia was obtained late into the night, but by 4 a.m, Amarendra was dead. The doctor on call at the time was not especially keen on signing the death certificate himself, and so he took it instead to a doctor that the family knew well, Dr. Sivapada Bhattacharjee, who had taken care of Benayendra and Amarendra's father during his illness. He signed the death certificate with the cause of death as septic pneumonia. Amarendra, however, had not died of septic pneumonia. Back in the lab at the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine, Dr. Santosh Gupta had been watching over Amarendra's blood test to see if any colonies would form. Something had certainly been grown in the glass dish, but the question was, what exactly was it? In 1933, the concept of using germs as a weapon was little more than a fantastical instrument conducted by the wild imaginings of the crime fiction author. Although there are several historical examples of armies using germs in warfare that date back centuries, such as the Assyrians poisoning wells with the ergo fungus, or Scythian archers dipping their arrow tips in rotting bodies of snakes and excrement, it wasn't until leaps were made in germ theory during the 19th century that the idea to systematically experiment with biological weaponry truly reached fruition. One of the earliest examples is that of the American-born German agent Anton Dilger. In 1915, Dilger travelled back to America from Germany with a briefcase containing cultures of anthrax and glanders, a contagious zoonotic disease that would cause death through eventual septicemia. Born in Virginia in 1884, Dilger had studied germ theory and microbiology in Germany several years before the start of the First World War, and when war broke out, he had worked as a battlefield surgeon on the German side throughout Europe. His pro-German political stance and United States passport set him up as a prime target for the Prussian Ministry of War, who enlisted him with the orders to carry out a new, fairly audacious plan. Upon his return to America, using his cover as a physician, Dilger set up a secret laboratory where, with the help of his brother Carl, a beer brewer with knowledge of propagating yeast cultures, they got started cultivating more of the deadly germs that he had carried across the ocean, using guinea pigs to experiment with the results. Weekly, German agents would stop by the basement of the brothers' 2-story white brick house, 6 miles from the White House, in order to collect small glass vials of their biological poison, which they would then distribute across the East Coast ports of America, where undercover German agents, working as dockhands, would inject livestock and horses bound for the European war effort. Eventually, finding himself under suspicion, Dilger fled to Mexico, but not before his germ factory had managed to kill thousands of horses and mules that would have otherwise aided in the war against Germany. Deirdre's lab was one example of several early examples of biological sabotage, wielding germs as a dangerous new weapon. The truth of the operation remained a secret for some time after the war, however. In the early 20th century, the idea that germs could be used as silent killers was popularised far more widely within the fiction of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Published in 1913, The Adventures of a Dying Detective, the infamous Detective Sherlock Holmes is seemingly dying from a rare tropical illness, contracted via a small booby-trapped ivory box that was sent to him through the post by a tropical disease expert from Sumatra, containing a sharp spring which he had infected with the bacteria of Tapanuli fever. When Watson retrieves the doctor and he sees Holmes in bed, dying, he confesses his crimes. When Watson goes to retrieve the sender and bring him to Sherlock Holmes, the doctor sees Holmes in bed, dying, and confesses his crimes, leading to Sherlock springing to his feet, declaring that he had not been poisoned by the box at all, and that his ruse was merely an elaborate trap to catch him red-handed, informing the doctor that he'd never touched the box in the first place. Whilst this story might seem somewhat obscure, it was a huge hit around the world, and especially in India, where Holmes's book and movies were particularly popular. The Adventures of the Dying Detective was made into a blockbuster hit in India, first in a 1921 short film, and then in 1931 when the first American talkie featuring Holmes made its way to Indian shores. The return of Sherlock Holmes once again returned to this idea of death by fatal injection, when Holmes tricked his arch-nemesis, Moriarty, into believing that he was dying after being pricked by a needle that had been laced with a toxin and hidden in a booby-trapped cigarette case. With Benayendra having such a passion for movies, it's certainly probable that he would have been sitting in a Calcutta theatre 2 years earlier, watching as Holmes gloated of his genius plan. Whether or not he recalled this scene 2 years later, when he was scheming to remove his brother from his inheritance, is another matter entirely. Around the time that The Return of Sherlock Holmes was making its way out to cinemas around the world, the Indian zamindar, Protapendra Chandra Pandey, was laying in bed in Pakur, gasping for a life that was slipping away from him minute by minute. Only 50 years old, he had contracted St. Anthony's fire and was gravely ill as fever, blisters and a burning red rash consumed his skin. His death was not a quick one, but when it came, it threw his family into chaos. Amarendra, who was leaving Pakur to study at the University of Patna, was swiftly removed from his cosy home, with its servants and plush surroundings, and instead placed into a hostel, all on the orders of his elder half-brother, Benayendra, who took the residence on for himself. The two sons had inherited the family title and estate, though due to Amarendra's young age, much of it had been locked away behind a trust. Whilst he was studying, and before he would come of age, Benayendra, the senior brother, was busy running the day-to-day affairs of the estate in his own way. Unfortunately, Benayendra's way was more about partying than it was about budgeting and responsible leadership. Keen on exploring the vice and excess of the Calcuttan elite, he had quickly alienated the majority of his family, including his surrogate mother, Surjabhati, who had been forced to step in and cover Amarendra's university expenses when Benayendra had abruptly cut him off. Always, Benayendra had told his younger brother that his lack of support was thanks to the estate suffering from a lean year, with poor harvests amongst the tenant farmers and high fees to the British, but it never seemed to stop him spending money wantonly on prostitutes, alcohol and his own private drivers, and Amarendra knew it. Soon after their father's death, Benayendra began a series of litigations against Surjabhati, with which he was hoping to leverage a good deal of property from her estate that she had inherited from her dead husband. In retaliation, as soon as he turned 18, Amarendra exercised his rights to the family income and began pressuring Benayendra for money to live whilst he studied at university. By 1932, the brothers' relationship was strained to the point of breaking, as Amarendra routinely wrote to Benayendra asking for money, and Benayendra replied, offering a pittance, whilst insisting that the family estate was existing more or less in poverty. In a huge pull of power, Amarendra executed power of attorney and appointed a manager to look after his share of the inheritance. at the same time keeping tabs on precisely how his brother was spending their money. What he found was not a minor income, but rather a manager who spent a great deal of money partying it up at every available opportunity. Meanwhile, as Amarendra discovered more and more about his brother's life of excess, Benoyendra was busy wining and dining with his new friend, Taranath Bhattacharjee. Taranath was a research assistant at the Calcutta Medical Supply Concern in one of the oldest hospital laboratories in India. Whilst there, he had worked in a laboratory researching pathology and bacteriology and had been involved with making various vaccines. Between his position as an assistant, Taranath supplemented his income by working as a physician, despite the fact that he'd never actually graduated as a doctor, having dropped out from the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine without paying any fees. Unsurprisingly, he never quite managed to get his practice fully off the ground, and he spent most of his time working as a doctor, pulling teeth from the mouths of desperate punters. Taranath met Benoyendra through his mistress, Balika, who happened to be one of his few regular patients. Benoyendra liked Taranath, who, along with Balika, enjoyed drinking, cinema and partying in Calcutta, and soon enough the threesome were living it up together. Taranath served another purpose for Benoyendra, though, and together they began hatching a plan to remove Amarendra from his meddling position, seeking to divide the Pakur estate. On the same day that Amarendra filed for power of attorney, Taranath, with the blessing of Benoyendra, wrote a telegram to the Hafkind Institute of Plague Research. The institute had been founded by Dr. Valdemar Hafkind in 1899, who had been assigned to work as a microbiologist in India, where he had worked making vaccines against cholera and bubonic plague. India had just recovered from a plague outbreak that had exploded in 1896. This outbreak had kicked off in China 40 years earlier in 1855. This epidemic had spread across Asia via plague-infected fleas that piggybacked off the emerging influx of commerce and trade, infecting cities that would flare up in mass outbreaks, eventually spreading to India by the mid-1890s. By the time that the disease had completely disappeared from the general population, it had managed to kill more than 12 million people from China and India, and almost 15 million worldwide. By the 1930s, the plague was almost entirely wiped out in India, and the Hafkind Institute had begun its transition to a teaching organisation. Taranath, using his research credentials, requested that the institute send him a specimen of virulent B. pestis culture in order to aid his research into plague at the medical school, he said. Unsurprisingly, Taranath soon found out that obtaining cultures of the plague was not a simple process, and a simple telegram was not really enough to secure such a sample. The institute wrote back to him shortly after, informing him that if he wished to obtain a sample, he should request it in a formal letter and include a detailed explanation of his purpose for acquiring it. Hoping to keep things simple, Taranath wrote back as requested, stating that he needed the sample for experimental animal inoculation in a laboratory. Hoping that this would be enough, he sent off the letter and waited. Unfortunately, this was once again rejected outright, this time with a much more final tone. The Institute was not willing to just send out a sample of plague to just anyone, and they now informed him that unless he was a government researcher or had government approval from the Surgeon General of Bengal, he was out of luck. For a sham doctor like Taranath, this was essentially a complete shutout. Not one to be deterred so easily, however, Taranath began searching through his various contacts in the city, and he soon found Dr. Ukil, who he had shared a laboratory with for a period. Dr. Ukil had just happened to be the director of tuberculosis research at the India Research Fund Association, and had had experience working with plague during his work in Paris. Explaining his predicament to the doctor, Taranath expressed his interest in working on his proposed cure for plague, making sure to play up the difficulty of obtaining a sample to actually get started. Happy to help a struggling, young and enthusiastic doctor, Ukil agreed to write to the Hafkind Institute on his behalf, and within the month, a plague culture of what the Institute called an especially virulent strain was sitting on his desk. Ukil instructed his laboratory assistants to begin the process of growing subcultures for Taranath's work, but after they failed to multiply as expected, the project never quite got off the ground, and the doctor destroyed the samples, figuring them dead on arrival. Taranath had come so close to obtaining his sample, only to be thwarted at the final hurdle, Meanwhile, Amarendra and Benoyendra's relationship continued to deteriorate. Benoyendra had discovered Amarendra's moves to watch over his running of the estate and began writing a series of thinly veiled threats to his brother, suggesting that if he didn't roll back his legal moves, he would be forced to cut his finances off entirely. Though, hoping to keep things civil, he made sure to assure Amarendra that his problems were not with him, only with his legal advisors. Striking a deal, Amarendra agreed to reverse the power of attorney in exchange for 1,000 rupees. But when he insisted that Benoyendra send him the money up front, the whole thing fell through. Benoyendra was also taking issue with how close Amarendra had been working with their surrogate mother, Surjabati, who was still embroiled in a complicated legal battle with Benoyendra. Benoyendra insisted that Amarendra denounce his relationship with her, saying that she had been working to drive a wedge between the two, and until he did so, he said there could be no brotherly dealings between them. Amarendra eventually agreed to meet Benoyendra halfway, by reversing his power of attorney, though he maintained his relationship with Surjabati. In response, Benoyendra sent him half of the 1,000 rupees that he'd initially agreed to. Given this situation, it was quite a surprise to Amarendra when Benoyendra showed up at Surjabati's house for the holidays in October of 1932. Amarendra had been staying with the family when Benoyendra arrived one afternoon, closely tailed by one of his associates, a local compounder who worked mixing and distributing medicines. Amarendra and Benoyendra went for a walk where they discussed the estate, and then, before he left, Benoyendra gifted his brother a new pair of pince-nez. Surprised, Amarendra tried the glasses on, but when he found them too small, he went to remove them, and Benoyendra, insisting that they should fit if he just pressed them onto his nose with a little more force, leaned over, gripped the glasses and pressed them hard onto the bridge of his nose. Flinching back in pain, Amarendra pulled back and grabbed the pince-nez and felt a damp fluid where the nose pads had pushed into his skin. Putting this odd scene behind him, he said goodbye to his brother with an uneasy wave and continued on with his holiday. 4 days after this strange meeting, Amarendra fell ill with a fever. When he woke, he found his whole body aching, and as the day progressed, he developed an unusual sensitivity to sunlight. Soon, his mouth began bleeding and muscle spasms rippled through his face and eyes. Before long, his entire jaw had locked in place. Doctors thought that he had come down with a cold initially, but as the symptoms progressed, they moved their diagnosis to something far more worrying. First, believing it to be rabies, and then finally accepting that Amarendra was suffering from tetanus. Concerned, Surjabati contacted Benoyendra and asked him to contact the family physician, but when he arrived later that day, it was his good friend and phony doctor, Taranath, instead. By now, Amarendra was unable to speak entirely and had to resort to communicating with his brother and the so-called doctor via written notes. He had been unable to eat or drink, and breathing was difficult. Strangely, Taranath suggested he stop taking the serum that had already been prescribed to him by another doctor, and instead he suggested that he take morphine instead in order to relax his muscles. Benoyendra offered up Taranath's services, insisting to Amarendra that he allow Taranath to stay on at the house where he could take care of his recovery full-time. But suspicious of his brother and believing that he had been poisoned via the pince-nez, Amarendra turned the offer down. This turned out to be quite a boon, as the moment they left, the original doctor who had prescribed the serum described Taranath as a rank amateur. Whether or not Amarendra had been poisoned with the tight-fitting pince-nez or not was up for some debate. Whilst the doctors who had seen to him agreed that it was a possibility, they also suggested that it had been far more likely that he had become infected when he had pierced a blister with his sewing needle 2 weeks earlier, though they did admit that the gap in time did make this less likely. Slowly but surely, Amarendra began to recover from his crippling illness. In fact, Amarendra had been lucky. Tetanus was a leading killer in India at the time, and whilst Amarendra had been luckier than he realised to survive at all, his recovery was far from straightforward. For a long time, he was unable to walk, and when he did recover control of his body, his heart never fully recovered. His paranoia around his brother's actions never quite recovered either, and his belief that Benoyendra had tried to kill him via a poisoned pair of pince-nez left him with a great deal of anxiety and worry that it would only be a matter of time before his brother would try to kill him again in order to take full control of the family estate. This was not at all helped when Benoyendra returned, some way into Amarendra's recovery, this time with a doctor named Durga Ratan Dar. Dar was an elite physician from Calcutta, and Amarendra's doctor stood down, recognising his top-tier education. Dar suggested injecting serum into Amarendra's right buttock, and within hours, Amarendra's condition had regressed, with symptoms returning. Still concerned about Benoyendra's motives, Amarendra contacted his brother again the next day, and again he returned with Dar, who insisted that Amarendra just needed to give the serum time to work. Sure enough, once Amarendra calmed down, his symptoms did improve, and eventually his recovery returned. A few days later, Dar came back once more with another elite doctor, Sivapada Bhattacharjee, who was known to the Pandey family thanks to his work caring for the brother's father during his own illness that eventually took his life. The two doctors examined Amarendra and, happy with his recovery so far, prescribed him a series of tonics and left, convinced that he was well on the path to recovery. It took Amarendra another 2 months to fully regain his ability to eat, talk and walk, though he continued to do so with some difficulty, and it would be many more months of what would essentially equate to physiotherapy before he would lose his awkward gait. Amarendra had developed some side effects, however. Aside from his weakened heart, he'd also developed a severe pain in his right leg. The area of his buttock that Dar had injected had developed a deep abscess, leading to an infection that had swollen to the size of an orange. It eventually took Amarendra almost 8 months to fully recover from the tetanus and associated complications, including 5 operations in order to clean out the abscess from his botched injection. All the while, he had been writing to his brother asking for money to pay his medical bills, and receiving nothing in return had led to him becoming deeply in debt. Whilst Amarendra was preoccupied with working on his recovery, Benoyendra continued to make himself busy raiding their shared inheritance. As his brother had slowly returned to full health, Sir Jabati had begun searching around for a wife for Amarendra, a move that Benoyendra saw as yet another hostile threat that would further dilute his father's wealth. Once again, he began working with Taranath to get his hands on a workable plague culture. Under the guise of visiting film producers, Benoyendra travelled to Bombay and met with one of Dr. Ukil's associates named Dr. Naidu, a bacteriologist and professor at the School of Tropical Medicine with a degree from Edinburgh University. Benoyendra told him that he was looking for facilities where he could test a cure for plague, using a letter of introduction from Dr. Ukil as leverage. Unfortunately, once again, Benoyendra found things far less straightforward than he would have hoped, and the doctor told him to write to the Hafkind Institute, which Benoyendra already knew would be a non-starter. 2 months later, he returned, this time to meet with a veterinary surgeon who worked under Dr. Naidu. Getting desperate and hoping to grease the wheels, Benoyendra offered him a healthy reward if he could help him to obtain a culture. But the doctor had no interest. He tried bribing him twice more, but it was all to no avail. Trying a new avenue, Benoyendra next contacted the superintendent of the Arthur Road Infectious Disease Hospital and the dean of the medical school at Bombay University, Dr. Patel. This time, the doctor was much more keen to help. Faking an illness, Benoyendra paid Dr. Patel way over the odds for his services, in return for his help in getting hold of a plague culture. For the doctor's part, he almost certainly thought that he was doing nothing more than fleecing a couple of amateurs who were ill-equipped to handle the sample, and almost definitely unable to realise any cure. Dr. Patel offered up the use of his own laboratory and contacted the Hafkind Institute, requesting a plague culture, which Taranath immediately began cultivating the day it arrived. Concerned that they would receive a duff sample again, they purchased a pair of rats from a local market and tested a swab of the cultivated culture on them by rubbing it onto their skin. Within a day, the first test rat had succumbed to illness, and the second rat was dead within 12 hours. Happy with these results, Taranath collected up his cultures, placed them in glass vials, and left Bombay overnight, citing a family emergency, leaving all of Dr. Patel's assistants confused as to exactly what they were doing. Meanwhile, Benoyendra stopped into a Bombay insurance agency and took out a life insurance policy on himself for 23,000 rupees and one for his brother, Amarendra, for 51,000 rupees. This, he said, was needed due to his brother's upcoming and quite fictional marriage. When Benoyendra and Taranath reconvened, it was in a makeshift laboratory set up in a rented garage in Calcutta that Tarannath had set up in advance. With a tested working culture on hand, the two set about the next stage of their plan. That September was a difficult month for the Pandey family. Amarendra and Benoyendra's sister, Kanambala, died unexpectedly of measles, and making matters worse for Benoyendra, Amarendra had once again resorted to legal help to resolve the issues of the family estate. This time, Amarendra had decided to work a little more covertly, and rather than tell his brother outright and taking power of attorney, he secretly employed the services of a legal team who could help him to divide the estate away from the courts, even if Benoyendra would not agree to an amicable deal. Sensing pressure from his brother, Benoyendra worked on extracting as much as he could, withdrawing 13,000 rupees from an account that had until now been held in trust. Amarendra knew all about the withdrawal thanks to his uncle, who he had installed in Benoyendra's house to work as an undercover agent, tasked with keeping tabs on Benoyendra and bribing his lawyers and accountants in order to put together a consistent paper trail documenting Benoyendra's less than above-board dealings. Unfortunately for Amarendra, his legal dealings were uncovered after he was forced to file a court objection blocking Benoyendra from withdrawing any more money from their trust accounts, confirming that he had actually never given his permission for his brother to remove any money at all. This effectively froze Benoyendra out of collecting any more cash from the banks, but it also signalled that Amarendra was up to something. On the 18th of November, Amarendra received a telegram from his aunt, Surjabati, telling him to visit as soon as possible, warning him to do nothing without consulting me. When he arrived, however, Surjabati denied having ever sent any telegram at all. Their suspicions that Amarendra had been duped by Benoyendra were soon confirmed when Benoyendra showed up the next day looking to speak with Amarendra. Even more strangely, it seemed as though Benoyendra wanted some kind of reconciliation, even agreeing to forging ahead with an amicable split to the family estate. With a clearer feeling in the air, Amarendra spent the week visiting family and enjoying what turned out to be an impromptu holiday, until Sunday, when he would travel back to Pakur with his family. Things soon flipped on their head when Amarendra was barged into on the train platform, leading to the suspicious pinprick in his right shoulder and his eventual death less than 2 weeks later. The day after Amarendra's death, members of the family visited Benoyendra to break the news to him and request his presence at the cremation, the responsibility of which fell to him as the leader of the family. Far from upset, Benoyendra span into a rage, claiming that no one had told him that Amarendra had been so sick, despite the fact that his own doctors had visited Amarendra just a day earlier. Using this as an example of the family's betrayal against him, Benoyendra refused to have anything to do with Amarendra's funeral, though he begrudgingly agreed to take care of the cremation. Later that day, as Amarendra's body was carried through the streets to the cremation ground, several people saw Benoyendra arrive in a taxi in what they described as a very jolly mood. Benoyendra seemed preoccupied throughout the cremation, and at one point he was seen as meeting with a strange man with a dark complexion who he was seen handing over a wad of cash to. As soon as the cremation was over, Benoyendra left with no other word, leaving everyone in the family more than a little confused. Meanwhile, back in the laboratory of Dr. Santosh Gupta in the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine, the doctor who had taken the blood sample from Amarendra during his illness was carefully watching over the culture that began to form in the glass vial. A day after Amarendra's death, there was enough growth for the doctor to extract a swab and check it under the microscope. Looking through the lens, he saw something quite unbelievable that forced him to seek the confirmation of his associates. All agreed that the bacteria they were looking at was almost certainly that of the plague. Still finding the presence of plague to be too unbelievable, they tested a culture on a rat, which died shortly after. When they carried out a post-mortem on its body, the results were clear. The rat had absolutely died of the plague. Pulling out a pen and paper, Dr. Santosh Gupta wrote his results on a letter and then delivered it to Amarendra's family. When Amarendra's uncle received the letter from Dr. Gupta, the results of the blood sample only sought to confirm suspicions that had already been circling throughout the family. That Benoyendra had somehow orchestrated an elaborate murder of his brother in order to remove him from the inheritance. Looking to move forward with a degree of secrecy, the uncle contacted a family lawyer named Kalidas Gupta and briefed him on their theories. Kalidas, in turn, repeated everything he learned to the public prosecutor, recommending that an inquiry be carried out since, no matter how fantastical the story might have sounded, there was enough suspicion surrounding the case to warrant such a move. Both agreed that care was required, since the whole thing involved what they called people of position and power. Kalidas was happy to accept the case on behalf of the family, and over Christmas and New Year he began to sort through the complications concerning whose jurisdiction the case actually fell to, since Amarendra's attack had taken place in Calcutta, far from his home in Pakur, where he had died. Soon after taking on the case, Benoyendra also visited Kalidas, asking him if anyone from the family had contacted him. Straight up lying, Kalidas assured Benoyendra that no one had, and when the brother asked the lawyer if he would work for him in the near future to organise the estate, Kalidas agreed in principle, hoping to keep him on side and maintain the secrecy surrounding the Pandey family's current moves. 10 days later, Benoyendra applied for a full possession of the entire estate. On the very same day, Kalidas handed in a 4-page official complaint to the police, followed by several members of the family and the family's staff giving their own witness testimonies against Benoyendra. Kalidas's next move was then to travel to Calcutta, where he visited the Assistant Commissioner, giving him an overview of the case so far, along with Amarendra's full blood report that had been supplied to him from Dr. Gupta. Everyone seemed to agree with the Pandey's family in that there was at least good reason for suspicion, not on just Benoyendra, but on Taranath and the 2 doctors, Dar and Sivapada too. Absolutely no one seemed to be happy that both were members of the elite, sure that people of such class would only make the investigation more delicate. That night, police visited Dr. Sivapada and interviewed him on his role during Amarendra's illness. Naturally, the doctor insisted that he had no suspicions towards Benoyendra, nor did he feel Amarendra's death was anything but natural. Unfortunately, with the interview taking place, the cat was well and truly out of the bag. Within 24 hours, Benoyendra had caught wind of the coming investigation and begun visiting various witnesses, pressuring them to give up any information that they knew on who it was that was questioning them and how they had come to begin any investigations. This put the police in a difficult situation. Naturally, they were concerned about the presence of corruption scuppering any serious investigation, but at the same time, they couldn't just crash in and arrest everyone with no evidence, especially not since they were all members of high society and would almost certainly ignite a public scandal. Their concerns were quickly cast aside, however, when they learnt that Benoyendra had booked a ticket on a sleeper train headed for Bombay, and worried that he might be fleeing, they ordered his arrest. By complete coincidence, the sleeper train that Benoyendra had boarded just so happened to also be carrying Kalidas, who was headed to Bombay in order to detail Benoyendra's earlier trail, when he had visited in order to try and ensure a plague culture. At 11:30 p.m, police boarded the train, interrupting Benoyendra in his sleep to inform him that he was under arrest for the suspicion of murder and conspiracy. Kalidas was all too happy to identify him for the police before settling back down for the night to continue his own investigation. The following day, Benoyendra was escorted back to Calcutta, where he was tossed into jail and his possessions were scoured over. Inside the suitcase that he was carrying to Bombay, the police found clothes, cash, and a full copy of Amarendra's blood report, as well as confidential memos that had been sent between Kalidas and the police. Equally as damning, and also confusing as to how he got hold of it, he had a long list of witness names in Bombay. Later that day, Dr. Dar was arrested in his home, whilst Taranath was instructed to present himself to the station at his earliest convenience. He did so the following day, and was also promptly arrested. Back in Bombay, Kalidas had arrived and spent his time tracking Benoyendra's movements. This had led the intrepid lawyer to a hotel owned by a man named Ratan Salaria, who had acted as a guide for Benoyendra during his visit, and was all too happy to take Kalidas to every last location. As soon as Kalidas contacted the police, they dispatched officers to meet him, where they interviewed over 200 witnesses, all uncovered by Kalidas with the assistance of this ruthless guide. The investigation had been swift, and it had needed to be, thanks to the status of the men arrested. Within a matter of weeks, all 4 men were behind bars, where they were pleading not guilty against charges of conspiracy and murder. Unsurprisingly, the case made headlines around the globe, as the world watched on in anticipation of their trial, the date of which had been set for July of 1934. Although much of the reporting gave a pretty muddled picture of events, they did at least capture the feeling of the onlookers when they called the whole thing weird. When the trial opened, most set themselves in for a long, drawn-out affair. No one expected that it would actually go on to be the longest trial to have ever taken place in India. Over the following 7.5 months, the prosecution called a total of 85 witnesses to the stand, many of which were doctors, researchers, or otherwise related to the medical industry, whilst the defence countered by calling no witnesses at all. Instead, the legal team of 29 men, working for the 4 different accused, worked to tear down the prosecution by pointing out the total lack of any actual evidence. The defence of Dar started quite well, especially after several doctors admitted that even the most well-intentioned doctors can carry out an injection that later goes on to become infected. Likewise, the defence for Benayendra and Taranath started strong, where they had the testimony of the poisoned pince-nez thrown out due to it relying on nothing more than hearsay. Benayendra's defence continued on the front foot by accusing doctors of botching the blood sample taken from Amarendra and even of faking the results, showing the presence of plague. Helping this case was the fact that Dr. Gupta, who had made the discovery, had burnt all of his original notes. They faltered somewhat when they suggested that maybe it had just not been plague at all and the doctors had simply made a mistake. This was a line that was roundly shot down by the flurry of doctors happy to stake their names on the recognition of the unique-looking bacteria. Countering once more, the defence posited that even if it was plague, there was really no evidence that Amarendra had been injected with it on the train station. No one had actually seen the attack, not the attacker, nor any weapon, both of which had never been found, and the only people willing to testify that it had happened were all heavily biased towards Amarendra. Amarendra's sister's death was brought back into play, suggesting that perhaps she had not died of measles at all, and had instead maybe died of plague, which she had passed naturally on to Amarendra. This line, however, was once more shot down, as doctors roundly agreed that the transmission time was simply too long. Continuing with the hypotheticals, the defence then focused on the attack itself, saying that a simple bump into someone would not have given even a skilled doctor enough time to actually inject a meaningful amount of anything into anyone. Further, they suggested that Amarendra's 3 layers of clothing would have only made this task even more unlikely. Doctors countered, saying that they believed only a tiny amount of plague would actually need to have been injected, citing the rapid spread of plague via flea bites as a perfect example of a tiny wound filled with a minuscule amount of bacteria still managing to have a devastating effect. The defence questioned then why it took Amarendra 8 full days to die, when most plague victims would die in half of that time, sometimes even less. Overall, it was a fairly strong defence, if it were not for the sheer amount of circumstantial evidence that all added up to paint a fairly convincing and damning picture for Benayendra and Taranath especially. The prosecution was also more than happy to air Benayendra and Taranath's salacious lifestyle to the court, informing the jury of Benayendra's use of prostitutes, his diagnosis of syphilis, and his carrying on with multiple mistresses. The defence attempted to counter this, suggesting that Amarendra's constant pleas for money from Benayendra was not actually for school or medical bills, but rather to pay for his own prostitutes, also suggesting that Amarendra's bout of tetanus had actually been late-stage syphilis. The judge forced the defence to withdraw this information, but it had already been aired to the whole court. Finally, the 4 accused gave their own prepared statements, though only Dr. Dar read his own. Benayendra's was a 5,000-word long exercise in creative writing, where he painted himself as a long-running victim who had lived a poor life full of suffering. His main accusation against the prosecution was that the entire case amounted to little more than a conspiracy to further ruin his difficult life. He furthered this by adding that he and his brother's relationship had always been one of a loving family. I did all I could, all that was humanely possible to do, to bring up my brother in a way befitting our position and means, and I spent some of my own money on him, his education and on his treatment. I had taught him to shoot and drive and to play tennis and other games, and altogether our relationship had ever been happy and friendly. There was not a whisper of my ever having tried to do any injury to my brother so long as he was alive. All sorts of inhuman allegations are cropping up when he is no longer on the face of this earth to refute them. In one of the more ridiculous paragraphs, Benayendra suggested that he and Taranath were complete strangers, a statement flying in the face of dozens of witnesses. Taranath's own statement was little better and consisted mostly of an effort to paint him as a good-willed physician who had given his life to the betterment of humanity, who had truthfully been working on a cure for the plague by mixing traditional Indian medicines with iodine. Dr. Sivapada argued in his statement that rather than work to kill Amarendra, he had in truth worked hard to save him, including obtaining and administering several difficult-to-get medications. Dr. Dar was the only defendant to read his own statement, wherein he said that the infection caused by his injection had been a case of sheer neglect. He said that Benayendra had never paid him more than what was expected for his services, and in fact, he still owed him a fair bit of money for the same treatments. In closing, the overarching point hammered home by the defence returned to the lack of material evidence offered up to the court for the prosecution. There were no witnesses to any attacks, no assassin, and no weapon. The evidence, they said, was purely circumstantial, circumstances that did not happen in reality. Their biggest fear, they said, was that of the bias placed upon the jury by the tabloid press, who had smeared their clients' names for months in the run-up to the trial. Finally, after a full 7.5 months, the judge stood up to make his own summary of the case. His speech was exhaustive, taking more than 8 full days of the court to conclude, and unfortunately for the defence, bordered on mistrial thanks to its lack of impartiality against Benayendra. At just after noon on the afternoon of the 16th of February 1935, the jury were finally sent out to make their decision. For such a long trial, they were only gone a relatively short time, returning just 4 hours later, delivering a verdict of guilty for both Benayendra and Taranath. Both Dr. Sivapada and Dr. Dar were acquitted of all charges. Their verdict was somewhat confused, however, when they added a plea for the judge to not inflict the death penalty on the guilty. The judge was not feeling so charitable. I am unable to agree with the recommendation to mercy. The murder was diabolically conceived and cold-bloodedly executed. I see no reason to refrain from passing the extreme sentence of the law. The judge then ordered them to be hanged by the neck until dead, giving them 7 days to launch an appeal, and then the court was finally dismissed. The news of the prosecution saw the case spread across the globe once more, even making the front page of the New York Times. The Germ murders, as it had become known, it said, was the strangest case in all of history. Amazingly, given his life of constant privilege and comfort, Benayendra had taken prison life quite well, whilst waiting for his trial, and now, even with his sentence passed, he continued to maintain his composed demeanour. Taranath was less together, and spent most of the days and nights following the sentencing, crying and yelling in anger. Unsurprisingly, the defence launched an appeal immediately on the grounds that the judge had directed the jury, and even less surprisingly, the appeals court actually agreed. What they did not agree upon, however, was that the decision was incorrect, ruling that even though the judge had acted poorly, the result had been the right one. Both Benayendra and Taranath, they concluded, were absolutely guilty, and as such, there would be no new trial. They did offer up some lenience when it came to the sentencing, however, and both men had the death sentence commuted for transportation for life to the Andaman Islands instead. Neither man would ever actually be transported, however, and would go on to serve their sentences in an Indian jail, or at least they served considerably reduced portions of their sentences. On the 28th of August 1947, 12 years after the guilty verdict was passed down upon them, both Benayendra and Taranath were released from prison as part of an amnesty enacted to coincide with the British departure from India. The years behind bars had done little to change Benayendra's tastes for life, and within 3 days he had made his way back to Pakur, where he set about raiding the estate's treasury, drinking and indulging in his old vices. Prison had given him one new, fairly strange obsession. He seemed to have developed an insatiable need to own a firearm. He took possession of a 12-gauge shotgun, but was told by his lawyers that he would have absolutely no chance of obtaining a rifle license thanks to his murder conviction. Instead, Benayendra looked for several loopholes, but every one came up short. At the same time, he paid a carpenter to build him a mobile barricade complete with gun slits, and he began stockpiling food and water in his castle palace. He then demanded his wife give him all the money from her account and then kicked her out of the house along with his son. The stage was set for Benoyendra's revenge. On the 21st of October, after his wife had visited the police station to tell them about Benoyendra's strange behaviour, an inspector and 2 constables approached the high stone walls of the Pakur palace. As they knocked heavily on the bolted doors, Benoyendra fired his shotgun into the air, sending them scurrying off away from the house. When they returned the next day, Benoyendra began shooting immediately, initiating what would escalate into a full-blown siege. Benoyendra had turned into what people called a desperate character bent upon creating serious trouble. Dressed from head to toe in black and hiding behind his mobile barricade, he spent 6 days firing at the local police, yelling about his plan to take vengeance on the witnesses who had testified against him. More worrying for the authorities, upon his release from prison, Benoyendra had written off the debts of the tenant farmers who rented his land, and now around 400 of them had come to his aid. In response, the police banned public assembly and called in the military. Shortly after, Benoyendra agreed to parley with the police, but their positivity was quickly deflated when it transpired that he only wanted to demand more opium. The next day, he shot 3 more police officers. When the military arrived on the 5th of November, they came in full force, firing mortars, machine guns, and even calling in the aid of 2 full-blown battle tanks. For several days, they battered the palace with shells, whilst police snipers took potshots whenever Benoyendra popped into view. Finally, after 25 full days of siege warfare, Benoyendra was spotted creeping up onto the roof. The military moved in, securing the ground floor, and then, in a confused flash, Benoyendra was dead. Some said that he was blown up by a grenade, others said that he had been shot, whilst others still said that he had shot himself, choosing to take his own life. However it happened, Benoyendra's wild vengeance was over. Following the guilty verdict, many unanswered questions were promptly cast aside and never truly closed. In particular, the question of whether or not Benoyendra had attempted to murder his brother via a pair of gifted spectacles was never concluded, and it was barely thought of again, though some did start to question precisely how deep he had experimented with biological weapons. In the years following the guilty verdict, rumours and theories were circulated concerning the death of both Benoyendra's father and his sister, both having died from illness, though no official inquiries were ever launched. The assassin nor the murder weapon were ever uncovered, though in fact the police actually had managed to track down a man that had been identified as the killer during the time that the case was going through the courts. Having received a tip-off from the same man who had rented his garage to Taranath to use as a secret laboratory, the man informed the police that Taranath had employed the services of an assistant who just so happened to match the description of the man of dark complexion that Amarendra had said had attacked him at the train station. Using their database of driving licence photographs to gain a positive ID, the police discovered his name, uncovering him as one Satish Chandra Das, a former gymnast turned local henchman who had been working as a mechanic and private driver. As it happened, one of the officers had known him as a teenager, and so the task to track him down fell to him and a small team who traced his family home in Calcutta, where they set up a stakeout hoping to snag him unawares. Sadly, Chandra Das was never seen nor heard from again, likely having already fled after the case blew up in the press. In the end, Benoyendra's dramatic siege was a fitting conclusion to what had been a dramatic case that had spanned the headlines of the world for its unusual execution, leaving behind a tale of tragic greed and unhinged revenge that does justice to its description in the courts as unique in the annals of crime. So that was, well, one of the strangest cases I think that has ever been on Dark Histories. And we'll talk a little about that after these short advert breaks. Welcome back. So yes, that was the case of the Germ murders, it became known as. I mean, where do we start really with this? I mean, interestingly, with this case, it's hard to find sources of any writing on the case, really, that isn't heavily biased against Benayendra. And by that, I mean, not that most things might think that he was guilty or anything, but writings tend to be, especially the Indian press, tend to be very much sort of painting Amarendra as this almost sort of saintly figure who could do no wrong, and Benayendra as this sort of absolute deviant. And I think that that's somewhat true, but I think it's probably more in the middle, where Amarendra probably had his own vices and Benayendra was probably not always a terrible human. And because I mean, Benayendra is truly painted as this kind of like evil, immoral kind of man. So here's the thing. This is where it gets difficult. I think that Benayendra probably was paranoid, but I think he seemed to have reasons to be paranoid. I think his reasons of conspiracy against his aunt and stuff like this, I don't know. It's really difficult to piece together how much that was paranoia and how much he maybe had a point there, because of, like I say, the way the sources sort of paint it very much in Amarendra's favour. But it is an interesting point, I think, that Amarendra was sort of, that perhaps Amarendra was not entirely perfect. The court transcripts, they mention that the defence does actually mention that Amarendra was sort of visiting sex workers just the same as Benayendra. Whether or not that was true or not, who knows? But that the fact they brought it up, to try and sort of paint him as this sort of less than angelic figure, was, I thought, quite telling. There is, I think, a debate to be had about Benayendra was known to be suffering from syphilis, and I think perhaps that may have played a role in his paranoia, and I think it almost certainly played a role in his meltdown at the end, which was completely crazy. The siege at the end is just madness of a finale to the story, really. That could have just been sort of rage and vengeance that had consumed him whilst he was sort of stewing in prison. But I sort of wondered if that had anything to do with late stage syphilis, maybe driven him somewhat mad. People that seen him after he was released from prison did say that he was unhinged, basically. Just coming up with these mad obsessions and completely unhinged. So, like I say, was he just consumed by rage and vengeance, or was it this kind of like late stage syphilis? I don't know. There are also obviously the questions of the pince-nez, were they actually poisoned with tetanus? The doctor suggested that maybe it was himself that had given himself tetanus by he pierced a blister with a sewing needle. Weirdly, I don't know. I don't know really enough about tetanus to know if the pince-nez could have happened. So I know that you can get incredibly virulent strains that don't even need to penetrate your skin. For example, the plague, they didn't penetrate the rat's skin with that. They just rubbed it on the rat's skin, and that still killed them. So I don't know if tetanus is such a virulent bacteria that just rubbing it on your skin is enough, because the pince-nez never broke his skin on his nose. It just pressed into it. I don't know enough about tetanus if that is possible. To me, his doctor's suggestion of it being the needle prick seems more likely, but I don't know. I think so Amarendra was clearly fairly paranoid at that time as well. There are also debates as well if we suggest that it was Benayendra trying to poison him with the pince-nez, then it brings up questions about his sister and his father, who died of two different diseases. It's a very simple step then to say, well, did he kill those as well? I'm not so sure he did. I think his sister, for starters, didn't really pose any threat to him, because she didn't really have any dibs on the estate. So I don't think his sister was really a problem for him. His father is obviously the more interesting one. The problem I think we have here is this was 1930s India, where these diseases were commonplace and they were fatal. If you did get them, like tetanus was fatal if you got it. Measles and the what was it, St. Anthony's fire that he got, which was a horrible kind of skin infection. These things were fatal if you got them. So, and they were excusably, they were things that people got quite, not frequently, but that they were around. So I'm not sure Benayendra really had anything to do with his sister and his dad, but I think, that once you start unraveling those layers of conspiracy, it naturally leads you to wonder if he did or not. I think it's an interesting case. I don't think it's as cut and shut as everything leads you to believe. When Benayendra has a point in his defense when he says, he got the aid of two very elite doctors from Calcutta to come and help his brother when he was suffering from tetanus, and when he was suffering from, plague. Did he do that to kind of cover his own tracks? I think probably did. Yeah, I think if that's the reason he did it, I think that's why. But it's a good point. Dar and Sivapada, they were these elite doctors, and he he didn't just get any old doctors. I think the more suspicious moment was when he had tetanus and he brought Taranath along with him and offered to leave Taranath there as a sort of on-call doctor. I think that is incredibly suspicious, especially if he had poisoned him with the pince-nez and then was going to basically leave his dodgy doctor there to essentially finish him off. But I'm not sure. I do think he's guilty, but I'm not. I wonder how cut and shut it is. So this is a particularly difficult case to read into without seeing bias throughout it. Even the court transcripts are worthless in that case because the judge was clearly, biased against Benayendra, like clearly biased. Even the appeal, basically, when it went to appeal, they said, the judge was directing the jury and was biased against Benayendra, but I think they said something along the lines of we are more than capable of coming to the same conclusion or coming to a conclusion, and our conclusion is that he's guilty, so therefore there's no new trial. Basically the judge was wrong, but the result was fine. There's nothing really in this that is not biased against Benayendra, which makes it very difficult to make any sort of proper judgment or outcome. But it's an interesting case. It's a mad case. It's completely insane, and it's fascinating in that they use this method to kill him if they did. I find that really interesting. That's that. I hope you enjoyed it. It's I think we've done quite a lot of true crime type episodes on dark histories recently. So probably next week or next episode I'll sort of look for something a bit different. But it was an interesting one to do, and I was really glad, like I said, to do something in India and sort of get away from the sort of Anglosphere that I tend to deal with when it comes to dark history. So that was really fun as well. If you want to contact me, you totally can do so. It's contact@darkhistories.com is the email. If there are links to darkhistories.com and stuff like that in the show notes, which has all the other links that you can get in touch with me as well, social media, and includes all the ways that you can support the show as well. You get ad-free episodes on Patreon, things like that, all of which are really great support. I do Dark Histories independently, completely by myself, and that it's not such a free and easy thing to do. But anyway, thanks very much for listening. I'll be back next week with another Yesterday Today, and then 2 weeks' time from now with another full episode. So I hope you enjoy Yesterday Today. Let me know if you are or if you're not, if you think it's worth me continuing. Otherwise, if you don't listen to it, never mind. Let's say 2 weeks' time, there'll be a new full episode as usual. So thanks very much for listening. Until then, next week or 2 weeks' time, take care, sleep tight.